name is Connor Flanagan, and I'm the assistant director here at the Southampton History Museum. Today, I'm joined by Sara Cedar Miller, and she is the historian emerita of the Central Park Conservancy and has started there as a photographer in 1984 and then became the historian in 1989. She currently lives here in Hampton Bays, and today we're going to be talking about her book, Before Central Park. We're going to be exploring a lot of different themes and histories of the Central Park area. If you have any questions about anything you see or hear in today's talk or anything else, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A or the chat functions below, and I'll join us back in at the end of the talk to ask Sara any of the questions you might have. So without any further ado, we're going to turn everything over to Sara, and enjoy, everybody.
Well, thank you very much for Connor for that lovely introduction. And I want to thank you and Tom Edmonds for inviting me. This is a real honor as a local East Ender. And so I know probably many of you tuning in have been to Central Park. If you haven't, this is more about what the land was before it was Central Park. It's a history that very few people know about. But I was really curious because I give tours of the park, and when people we start the tours, people say, well, what was it before it was a park? So I decided to do a lot of research, and this is the result of it. I want to dedicate not only this lecture, but let you know that the book was also dedicated to Marge Sullivan, the beloved trustee of the museum, who sadly never got to see this book, and in her hand, the Halsey House Garden is part of her legacy. And she was also, and most importantly, aside from being a dear, dear friend, she was the one who gave the grant to Columbia University Press so the book could be printed in color, very appropriate for someone who loved gardens so much. So the book is divided in the park is divided into 3 sections as well as the park. Part 1 is about the topography, which is all about why people would live there or not live there or do what they do on the landscape. Part 2 is about real estate, and part 3 is the idea of a park. And so we'll start with, and as you can see on this picture on the left of the map of Central Park, Bloomingdale was the edge of Bloomingdale went all the way west to the Hudson River. Yorkville went all the way east to the East River, and Harlem went all the way north to basically the Bronx, as well as a little bit of the east as well, just to orient you for the landscape that we'll be talking about today. So we'll start with Harlem, and we'll also start with why people moved to Harlem, the first family that moved there, and we have to go back to the Dutch history. This is a Rembrandt painting where you can see everyone wearing their beaver hats, and this was the rage, the fashionable rage in Europe at the time, not just for the Dutch people. Beaver is soft and supple and waterproof before we had Gore-Tex clothing. And the beavers were out of Europe. They were extinct, and they were getting the beavers fur from Russia, and that was becoming extinct when the French discovered beavers in Canada. And when the Dutch got hold of this information, they decided, here's a cute little beaver with his tail, a delicacy. I did not know that until I started this research. And so as you can see in the red line is Central Park, and beavers live in special shallow fresh waters. And you can see within Manhattan, but also in Central Park, there was plenty of beaver habitats. And so we know that the Native Americans who were here first in Manhattan, of course, would have hunted and trapped beavers. The beavers are so important that they became the seal for New Netherlands back in the 1600s. And even today, you can see the beavers. There are two of them here and here on the seal of the city of New York, which shocks people when they learn that there are beavers on our official seal. So the Native Americans, who did not ever have a settlement in Central Park, did have settlements up in the Harlem around 125th Street area, in the East River. They also had a lot of settlements in Inwood Park at the north end of Manhattan, right before it goes to the Bronx, and of course, north in the Bronx, and as well as south to the Battery. So what the native tribe, the Lenape, did was create a trail that went through Central Park, and you can see it coming in at about 110th Street. That's what this line is, 110th. This vertical line is Fifth Avenue, and you can see that the trail, which the people who made this map call the Manhattan Path, that ended at 92nd Street. And so that path became what's known as, it was the Wichquajic Trail. That's a local Lenape group. And then the Kingsbridge Road, which is the British. And in the Central Park Conservancy in 2013, unearthed the Kingsbridge Road, which we had no idea still existed, 18 inches below the ground. And it was composed of these tiny little stones that were pounded and hardened into the soil. These big stones were holding up a gatehouse from the War of 1812 that I'll get to later. But it's these millions of stones that went 13 miles from one end of Manhattan to the other back in the day. Here's the Harlem Mirror today. You can see 110th Street. This is the Dana Discovery Center and the Harlem Mirror. And the road would have come in from what is now Lenox Avenue or Malcolm X Boulevard, through originally 6th Avenue, through the narrowest part of the Harlem Mirror, and across into a narrow wall of rock that I'll talk about in a minute. The X is going to be a place where I believe the first Europeans moved into Central Park. And also there were taverns in the site of a tavern. So here is a map, and I'm going to try to orient you to the story, the early story of the park. So here's the East River, and up through 108th Street to 109th Street was a stream that came all the way through to 110th, crossed Harlem diagonally to 125th Street, known as the Harlem Creek. You can see these huge, Central Harlem was agricultural field. It was flat, unlike what we know in Central Park, which was rocky, swampy, and very hilly. These fields created more or less as agricultural fields by the Lenape were very desirable land because the soil was rich. Manhattan didn't have a lot of agriculture, but this was over 200 acres for them to grow crops. And that is the reason, for the most part, that the first European family settled on that red X that I showed you. McGowan's Pass is here's the road, and the Kingsbridge Road, or the Lenape's Trail. And what it did was have a break in a wall of rock that still to this day crosses the park. And that is why the trail is where it is, because it could come in through the agricultural area. You would be near the swamp and you could get a boat to the East River. You had a road and you had all this agriculture. And so that is why the first family European family, which I'll talk about in 1 minute, came to Central Park for the first family that moved in up at the north end of the island. Everybody else lived down near the Battery, where there was a fort. Here's 110th Street, and this is a postcard from the 19th century, and you can see that it's still all very agricultural. So this is the DeForest Montaigne Tobacco Farm. Yes, the first farm on Manhattan Island of any major single crop was tobacco. The DeForest and Montaigne family, they were intertwined, were Protestants who fled Europe's Catholic Spain, not Catholic Spain, Catholic France, and moved to the Netherlands to gain religious freedom, and then from there traveled around the world until they finally settled right about the southern border of the north end of Central Park. We know from records that still exist in Albany that the houses would have had a thatched roof. We know that they would have had a palisade along the border. They had their tobacco barn for drying and the dwelling, and the hay rick for the hay for their animals. They would have brought their domestic animals, horses, cows, from Europe all the way on a boat. So really hard to imagine getting all of that this far, but they did. And they were here in 1637, starting their tobacco farm. The first year, they had a tremendous successful crop. This is a pathway in Central Park, not particularly significant if you're just taking a walk, but one of the most important historic spots in Central Park, because this is where the break, you can't see the rock behind these trees, but these two rocks were the only break for the trail to cross what is originally a swamp and come up through what became Central Park. And the road down to the southern part of the border. Taverns grow up along the road, Dutch taverns first, and then English taverns. This is a drawing of one of the taverns. They were not very beautiful roadside taverns, but people could come, water their horses, get something to eat or sleep there, and then be on the road one way or the other. This was basically halfway between one end of Manhattan to the other. So the taverns in this area were often called halfway houses. You can see now that one of the taverns was enlarged. It became the Benson and McGowan family homestead. They had the tavern right along the side of the road. They were a very wealthy landowning Harlem family from 1756 when they built this house and tavern. Here are two of the portraits that the New York Historical Society has. Margaret Benson, although she looks somewhat shy and retiring, was actually the richest widow in all of Harlem. She owned much of it as a Benson, part of the Benson family. And then her son, Andrew McGowan Jr., a lovely portrait of him as well. And these are the people who, for the most part, lived and owned the land in the upper part of Central Park. In their tavern, there was a secret meeting that really almost nobody knows about. I was shocked when I learned about it in reading about it in George Washington papers, that there was the road and the British were attacking in September of 1776. And George Washington and his generals held a secret meeting on September 7th to decide whether they should evacuate Manhattan Island. The British were coming up both ends of the Hudson River and the East River and encircling the island, and George Washington and his generals and the Congress in Philadelphia decided not to evacuate. And so they put some of their troops all the way up in Harlem, but for the most part, they left troops in Manhattan Island, and then the boats kept coming and coming. And George Washington's generals begged him for another secret Council of War meeting, which was held September 12th, 1776. And I always wanted to know, I always like to know where things happen. And long story short, I discovered that it happened in that tavern, the McGowan Tavern in Central Park, where the generals voted to vote in order to have, here's the first to vote to evacuate. So this is what a Council of War meeting some artist envisioned. The first one in September 7th. We can't, the McGowan Tavern looked nothing like the background of this beautiful house down on Varick Street in Manhattan. But the generals in the McGowan Tavern secret meeting, 7 generals voted in order to have evacuation, and 3 decided to stay and fight. One of the generals, McDougal of McDougal Street, he voted to evacuate, and one of the 3 was General William Heath. Later, the 2 men would find themselves at West Point with General Heath as McDougal's superior officer, and at a secret at a social hour, that is what General McDougal called it, he let out that General Heath was one of the 3 people who did not vote for evacuation, and called him a knave, basically a scoundrel. And this got back to Heath, who court-martialed McDougal, and there was a trial. And that is how we know that the secret meeting that George Washington and his generals had was in what is in the McGowan Tavern in Central Park. So the British, they, of course, came in 3 days later after the meeting on 84 gunboats and attacked Manhattan Island and Kips Bay, basically 34th Street. And they went up to the Kingsbridge Road. The Americans avoided them by going up the Bloomingdale Road, which is basically today Broadway on the west side. And the British stayed in Manhattan Island, and New York City, a lot of people don't realize this, became the largest British city outside of London for the 8 years of the Revolutionary War, 7 years, sorry. And in the Great Hill, which is a part not too many people know about, but it's a high hill on the west side of Central Park, this is the type of huts that the British soldiers and Hessian soldiers, German mercenaries, would have had. This is a drawing from a painting from another site up at Inwood Park, but this would have been similar to the drawing built into the hill to save on heat for the British soldiers who were there for 7 years. Evidence definitely was discovered by Olmsted. When he was building Central Park, he saw the remains of those huts on the Great Hill. And Revolutionary War redcoat buttons, they found those as well. So the McGowans sold their tavern to the Sisters of Charity of Mount St. Vincent, a Catholic group that had a school and a mother house for their novitiates. Later, Olmsted and Vaux's families would move into this area while they were building Central Park. This beautiful building burnt down in 1881. They built another tavern, and they also knocked it down in 1915. So today, this area is the composting area of Central Park, where we bring all the dried leaves and all the branches and all the mulch and all the turn it over every year so that Central Park stays green and healthy. So now we're getting to part 2, and we're going to talk about 2 communities, Yorkville and Bloomingdale. This is when in the late 18th, early 19th century, these communities became much more involved in real estate when instead of topography, because the areas were not beautiful like Harlem, which was flatter and had better land, but these communities were rocky and swampy. They were called the common land of New York, and they were called so because they were owned by the municipality, since no one wanted to use it as private land. It was too bad. So in 1786, this was given over by the British. Here's the private land in Manhattan. You can see it in pink. And all of this green and yellow was owned by the city of New York, which was the largest land owners in the city. So I'm sorry, I made a mistake on the date. It was 1686, which after the British attacked and took over Manhattan from the Dutch in 1664, by 1686, they made all of this land municipal land. And when, after the Revolutionary War, New York City was broke, they had no money. And so they gave the land over to purchase. They divided it up into 5 acres into a grid, not the grid we have today, but quite similar. And the green were for sale and the yellow were for rent. They figured that if the people who bought the land for sale improved it, that would improve the land for rent next door to it. And that would make more money when the city decided to sell it. So very shrewd. These are the rocky, swampy pictures of Central Park, not the park you know today. It was filled with these massive rock outcrops, which of course are still in the park today. There were glacial erratics, these little tiny rocks back here that were dumped from a glacier 11,000 years ago. You can see pictures of these glaciers. This is Fifth Avenue in 1862, and they're building the park and they're putting up a wall, and you can see the boulders, very few trees, and this muddy piece of strip here is what is now Fifth Avenue around 86th Street. So many people bought these little plots of land, green, or rented them on the yellow ones. One of them, James Amory, bought up all his neighbors' land and had a huge amount of the most famous landscapes in the park today: Bethesda Terrace, the mall, big part of Sheep Meadow, the East Green, Rumsey Playfield, and even part of the city or to Madison Avenue in the 60s. So this is some of James Amory land today. He had a farm, and we know he grew many different crops because he kept trying to sell his land. So we know when you put an ad, a real estate ad in the newspaper, which is how they sold real estate, no different than today, except that now we put it on the internet. He told you what his house was like and what he was growing and what kind of trees he had. So we know a lot about these pre-park owners, particularly James Amory. But James Amory wasn't just a farmer. He was also a whip maker, horse whips. And that is what, here is a picture. I tried to find a picture of an Amory horsewhip. If he was so famous, as was his father, there must be at least one existing in the world. And so after trying many times to find one, I wrote in Google, I Googled riding crop Amory, because Googling Amory horsewhip wasn't getting me anywhere. And up came this beautiful picture, and you can see Amory on the silver tipped handle, and then the letters GW. And this riding crop, and here's the full picture of it, belongs to none other than George Washington, and it's the pride of Mount Vernon in Virginia. So also this common land, the New York City had polluted all of its water, and they needed to find out how to get fresh water into Manhattan Island. And so they used the Croton River up in Westchester, 40 miles north of 42nd Street. And they brought the water into through underground and above ground tunnels into Central Park from what would be today 79th to 86th Street. And so here is the basin. Today, you can see both reservoirs. This is the reservoir that was built in 1842. And this is, of course, the reservoir, the Jacqueline O'Kennedy Onassis Reservoir that still exists in the park today. The pipes went through the Metropolitan Museum of Art, down Fifth Avenue to the Public Library on 42nd Street, where the water pipes all went downtown into people's streets and pumps and homes. In 1931, the reservoir was filled in, and today it's the Great Lawn, which hosts many concerts in the park that maybe some of you have been to. So we're also going to talk about Seneca Village, which you may have heard about, the African-American community that was the largest property owning African-American community, not just in New York, but probably within the entire country. It started by this man, John Whitehead, a white man, and his wife, Elizabeth, who was a cart man, and cartmen were very prestigious. Today, they would be taxi drivers, or they would be teamsters, truck drivers, but that's how everything worked in New York City. And John Whitehead was quite wealthy. They were able to vote, and even if you didn't own property, if you were a cartman, you were allowed to vote. So John Whitehead bought a whole bunch of land on the west side in Bloomingdale from the 83rd Street to 89th Street, 7th Avenue to halfway to 8th Avenue. And to that, he sold it to African-American community. And in 1855, when it was divided up to pay the owners for Central Park, you can see it was at its peak. And so here is 87th Street, 88th Street's up here, and all of these red houses would have been owned by either African Americans at this point or rented out, which was frequent. And about 200 people lived in the village in 1855, most of whom were Black, but there were some people who were also Irish or German immigrants, because immigration happened in the 1840s when the Germans and Irish started coming to America. So we know a lot about some of the people in Seneca Village. They were often the leaders of the Black community downtown. 75% of the people, white or Black, in 1855 who owned land in Seneca Village never lived there. So that they want, but these Black leaders, often called the Black elite, were supportive of a Black community, even though there were businesses or their families owned homes downtown. Albro Lyons and his brother-in-law, Pierre Guignon, were successful businessmen. They both had gone to the New York African Free School, which was a school by the Manumission Society that had the highest level of education for Black people in New York. Also, some of the people who owned the land were Charles B. Ray, Theodore Wright, and James Gloucester, who were also very prominent people in the Black community, all reverends. Seneca Village had 3 churches. 2 of them were AME Zion and African Union, entirely Black churches, and one of them from 1849, All Angels Church, which was mixed white, Black, and white. And they were all advocates. They were all very much involved in the Underground Railroad. And it's very, very possible that the reason that they were looking at buying land in Seneca Village had to do with turning it over to become a place for refuge for escaped slaves from the South who were coming through New York or off a boat or off the railroad, many different stories, or on foot, and coming through and needed assistance on their way to northern Canada, where they would escape and be free. James Gloucester owned land in Seneca Village, but his wife was really the owner. She was an early feminist, a very big advocate. This beautiful Cherry LA on the west side of the reservoir was her land, one lot that she bought. She bought it for $40 in 1849. And when she died in 1883, she became the richest Black woman in America. And she got her start here in Seneca Village. She was an activist, and there's so much you could talk about all of the women of Seneca Village who are very strong, active women. But I, worry that we don't have enough time today. So we'll talk about the idea for a park next. So in 1825, New York City became very wealthy at the time. It became the country's most important center of commerce because of the Erie Canal that went across New York State, hit the Hudson River from, Lake Erie at Buffalo, where that was a connection to the West, and all the wheat that was grown in the world at this time was coming from the West down on barges to the Hudson River, and then down to New York, and then on ships to Europe, or ships to New England, to places in other parts of the country, including the South. So New York became very wealthy, and in 1825, John Whitehead was not the only person to divide his land to create real estate. And so the city was growing. 1840s, as I said, there was a tremendous amount of immigration coming into the city, and people had nowhere to go. The plan for New York had tiny little postage stamp parks. This City Hall Park, if you know it, was the largest park, which is really just a tiny little green square around Central City Hall. That's what I'm trying to say, not Central Park. City Hall was the largest park in the city, and people wanted to ride their carriages. They wanted to see nature. They wanted a vast park. And so in 1853, they took the land for the park, and it became a park. At the time, it only went up to 106th Street. Later, it went up to 110th Street. So today it's 843 acres. What we didn't know was when they bought the land, the New York City bought the land for the park, the Seneca Village landowners and all the other landowners, we knew it would cost $5 million, which was a huge amount of money in 1856 when they actually paid the landowners. But what did Elizabeth Gloucester get, and what did all the other landowners get? We didn't know. There was very few records until 2017, when up popped this picture on my computer from a friend who knew I was really curious about where the records were, because they were lost. And these records were found in a Brooklyn storehouse in 2017. And I can't tell you, to me, it was like finding King Tut's tomb, and the gold was in those books. And from it, we know not all, but almost all of how much each individual landowner was paid. Here is a page of it. And so we could see that Elizabeth McCollin from Seneca Village received $1,550 for her house and her lot. And here is her lot was block number 786, lot 37. And she was well educated because many people who couldn't write, not just Black people, but many people, particularly women, widows who lived in the park, were never given an education. But here you can see that Elizabeth Collin signed her own name. This is a piece of her map. This is her husband also owned land next door to her, and she got $740 for her lot and $810 for her house, and shed, which must have been a very beautiful house. I don't expect you to be able to read this, but basically I calculated what the criteria was, who owned the land and how it was valued. And it all comes down to the way real estate is valued today: location, location, location. So the built up city is south of 59th Street, which is down here. They are the people, even though their land was the worst land in the park, the rockiest and the swampiest, they got the most money because they were the closest to the built up city. Fifth Avenue, Sixth Avenue, Seventh Avenue, and Eighth Avenue. If you owned land on a corner, you were more valuable. If you owned land in the middle of a block, so these are the buildings in the middle of a block, they were valued less than the buildings that fronted on an avenue. So it was depending on where you lived and where you owned your land, that's what you were paid. So here, for example, it was Seneca Village up here next to the Recording Reservoir. 86th Street was a crosstown street because they needed to create 86th Street. The grid had not gotten up this far, but because they needed to build that reservoir that you saw earlier, they created 86th Street, which went right through Seneca Village, and the people who lived there got much more money than even people further to the south. But in general, people in Seneca Village got more than the people in the 90s, they were in the 80s, and less than the people in the 70s, and even less than the people in the 60s. So the people on Fifth Avenue got more because the lots fronting Fifth Avenue to Sixth Avenue were actually bigger lots. So it all came down to, in the US Constitution, a municipality could take land through eminent domain. That is how New York City took the land for Central Park. But you had to have just compensation, and just compensation, that's what it says in the Constitution, basically comes down to fair market value. So in fact, we have shown that this amount of money that each person got in Central Park was fair market value. And so just to end on what isn't before Central Park is the design competition of 1858. Here is Frederick Law Olmsted on the left and Calvert Vaux on the right, the co-designers of the park. It was actually Calvert Vaux who invited Olmsted to partner with him on a design competition. It was also Calvert Vaux who just convinced the Board of Commissioners to hold a design competition. And so here was the famous duo. Very few people know that actually when Frederick Law Olmsted was asked by Calvert Vaux, who they had only met once before, to help him in the design for the competition, Frederick Law Olmsted actually said no. But it took a lot of pleading of Calvert Vaux to get him to say yes. And ultimately, we know the answer. They won the design competition, and their design is now in the municipal archives. Here is the reservoir that we have today. Here is the old reservoir that only was drained in 1931 to become the Great Lawn. Here's the mall with the LA of trees, Sheep Meadow. A lot has changed. This plot only goes up to 106th Street. They bought the next 4 blocks at 110th Street. Originally, to buy the land for the reservoir was approximately $2,000 an acre in 1830s. Then when they bought most of Central Park, it had risen to $8,000 an acre. And when they bought the last 4 blocks of Central Park in 1863, the land was valued at $18,000 an acre. So Manhattan has always been a very expensive place to buy land, and that hasn't changed a bit. They got their design inspiration from private parks in London. This is Stourhead, or Birkenhead Park in Liverpool that Olmsted had visited in 1852. They also got their inspiration from Hudson River School paintings that are, very well known, and the America's first real school of painting and of landscapes. And Frederick Church, who is the painter of this, as many other pastoral, beautiful Hudson River School paintings, was actually the teacher of Jervis McEntee, more or less a lesser known Hudson River School painter, but his brother-in-law was actually Calvert Vaux, the designer of Central Park. So they knew much about land in England, they knew much about landscapes in America, and they knew about the Hudson River School paintings. So they created the park out of, very rocky, swampy land that you saw earlier. The Irish are the ones who were the laborers who built the park. I like to say that's why Central Park is so green. And there were some Germans too. The greatest creation of their design was those transverse roads. In the competition, you had to design roads that went across the park at 4 different locations. Olmsted and Vaux were the only ones who sank those roads, which I'm sure you've all been on a bus or a taxi or driven across the transverse roads with the park above you and all the traffic 24 hours a day going through it, because they wanted Central Park to be the refuge that it is today, but they didn't want the 24-hour-a-day traffic. So they sunk the roads, and therefore Central Park is the only park where there's no intrusion of the city whatsoever, especially since in the last few years, traffic is not allowed even on rush hour. No time in at present can traffic go through the park. So it is really quite a refuge. You can see from this aerial, this is 96th Street, that they tunnel their way through. This is the drive in Central Park, the East Meadow, and here is the sunken transverse road going through the park. Here's the reservoir over here. And then the park is divided into 3 different kinds of landscapes. The pastoral, which is like pasture, so open water, big stretches of water. They're all man-made. Central Park's water bodies can be turned on just like your kitchen sink. With a faucet, we can turn it on and we can turn it off to repair things, and we do. Here it is today, and looking from basically 73rd Street, looking north towards the north end of the park. The pastoral park had sheep on its meadow. Here is Sheep Meadow. We call it Sheep Meadow. They used to call it the Green. Here it is today, a beautiful green space in the park. And in the woodlands, there were beautiful trees, and it was mysterious and very dense vegetation. You couldn't always see where you were going. They wanted it to be like the recreation of the Adirondacks. And so they also created man-made waterfalls. Here is one up at the north end of the park today. Very much, that's New York City drinking water flowing over rocks that have been blasted from the rock outcrops and turned into beautiful waterfalls. The Central Park Conservancy has been restoring the park for the past 42 years. And our last effort is up at the Harlem, and it is going to be to create this rink and pool and connect it with the woodlands, like the waterfall you just saw. It's going to be open in 2024, but even before that, I hope you will come back to Central Park now that you have more prehistory. You'll visit. We also have public tours. I also give tours, and we would love you to join in and with the Conservancy, or just visit and enjoy what is the jewel of Manhattan. And now I'll take questions. Once again, thank you for inviting me to give this talk today. And please ask questions.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. This was great. I've been to Central Park many times. And I have not known pretty much any of this information before today. So yeah, it's really great to know. And I think I would say if anybody's going to the city anytime soon, I think you should reach out for a tour, because it's already great to walk around and see it on your own. But, you know, getting to walk around and hear this information while you're there would probably be extra great.
Yeah, we have public tours. You can go on Central Park Conservancy's website, Central Park NYC. Don't forget the nyc.org. And you can sign up or contact me on, I think, beforecentralpark.com.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. I definitely recommend everybody doing that. Now, if you do have any questions, please feel free to submit those in either the Q&A or the chat function here on Zoom, and I'll go through those now, and we'll see what we have. So let's see. First up, we have, do you know why the word Seneca, a Roman philosopher, was used to name a Black community?
I do, or I should say, I have a really good guess. It's a long, complicated story, but before Olmsted and Vaux, so we have to talk about Egbert Ville. Egbert Ville was actually the first designer of Central Park. There was one before Olmsted and Vaux came along. And so Egbert Ville he knew the park was coming. He was a West Point brigadier general and trained in sanitary engineering. He worked for the state of New Jersey. He was appointed engineer of the park in 1857, and he started even before that. There's a whole chapter on him in the book, so I'm trying to synthesize. But he was going through the park, trying to design it, because he knew that he wanted a head start on having a design and a study of the topography before anybody else did. So he got the job, and his plan for the park was, his original plan is lost. We don't know it, but luckily there was a New York Herald reporter who was really on the case of the park and trying to find out what was really going on, because a lot of this stuff was secret during the secret meetings with Fernando Wood, who was the most corrupt mayor of New York City, who was the one who became self-appointed park commissioner, who appointed Ville. Anyway, so in this report, this reporter described in the Herald what Ville's plan looked like. And in it, he mentioned that a lot of the paths in Ville's park and all of the drives were named after Indian counties of New York State with Indian names. Yes, he said Indian, not Native American. So the minute I went to school in Syracuse in upstate New York, and the minute I read that, I went Seneca, because Seneca is a county right next to, it's the county next to with Rochester. And so it made a lot of sense that in this lost plan, while the Seneca Village people are still living there, that he must have just inadvertently put a drive or a path around the Seneca Village area of his plan. There were the first people who wrote the word Seneca one was in 1873, long after Seneca Village existed, and then really became known when a book came out in 1907. I think these ministers, these two white ministers from All Angels Church, who had a missionary church in Seneca Village, did not want to call the N word, which is how everybody described Black people, but lower class white people used that term, and there was no proper term. Colored people sometimes was used, and I think the ministers were very sensitive about referring to the Black community, and so they took Ville's plan and saw that Seneca was the road and pathways around that area of the park, and just used it and referenced it in a book. One of the ministers wrote about it in 1873, and then again his son wrote about it in 1907. I have read every deed, every newspaper, every government issued paper, everything. The word Seneca Village was never, ever, ever used by Black people to talk about their community. And in fact, Mauricia Lyons, the daughter of Albro Lyons, who I talked about, wrote an entire autobiography and biography of her family. And the only thing she said was, my family owned a plot of land that is now Central Park. She would have known that it was called Seneca Village, and she would have used it. And in another trial from another Black landowner of Seneca Village, she just called it Yorkville. They never referred to it as Seneca Village. It's a made-up name by, I suspect, Reverend Thomas McClure, or Reverend William, I forget, is Richmond. And but now we have a neutral name, but it doesn't really reflect the community, the need for the community to have a name, which I find pretty interesting.
That is interesting. That so did they have a name for the neighborhood at the time when he was there, or was it Yorkville? Was
Yorkville.
it Yorkville?
In my book, I put it in Bloomingdale because all the previous owners to the land that became Seneca Village, they call it Bloomingdale, and only for whatever reason the people in Seneca Village or that area called it Yorkville. They're the only ones, but every previous owner, and there are lots. I traced the land all the way from the beginning. The Delanceys of Delancey Street were the first owners of Seneca Village, and then I traced it all the way down to John Whitehead, who I believe was working with the Black community to make this land. He was kind of a free thinker, John Whitehead, but no, Yorkville was the deeds when they mention it, because they didn't talk about streets and avenues. There were no streets and avenues. It wasn't 86th Street. It wasn't 84th Street. It wasn't 7th Avenue. Those existed on paper. But they talked about chains and rods, and that's how surveyors measured. And so they only called it a few times Yorkville.
Interesting. Yeah, it's always one of those fun parts of doing historical research, is people just arbitrarily changing the names of things as time goes on, and you have to do a little bit extra work to figure that out.
Yeah, people do it in the park today. They name things.
Yeah.
Now it has a official name, so they're like Dog Hill. People ask me where Rabbit Hill is. I'm like, wait, I don't know. I never heard of it.
So let's see some of these other questions we have. I once heard that Broadway used to be called Bloomingdale Road. Is that possible?
That is true. And it's because all of basically Bloomingdale started at 34th Street. And the reason it's called Bloomingdale, this is in the book, it's an important thing to know about. The whole west side was Bloomingdale, starting at 34th Street to about 120th Street, because it was blooming with wildflowers, beautiful wildflowers all the way to the Hudson River. And people would write about how beautiful it was. And Bloomingdale was where they grew the tulips during the Dutch area. So the Dutch called it Bloomingdale, and the English, because they didn't want to use a Dutch term, called it Bloomingdale. It has nothing to do with the store. But in the West 90s, that is still the neighborhood of Bloomingdale.
Okay. It's always interesting, again, hearing how the names of places alter and change and stuff like that, how they took a Dutch word and just sort of anglicized it a little bit to become Bloomingdale.
Exactly.
But let's see, someone else was saying, not a question, but they were saying how lucky they are to have 5 Olmsted parks in the town that they live in.
Oh, which
Yeah.
town? Oh,
I'm curious, yeah. If you're still here, let us know what town you're in. That'd be really interesting.
New York has.
This other question that we have here, it says, your book is a wealth of information. It must have been difficult giving us a skim version. Many thanks for your fascinating program. So again, not a question, more of a comment.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm honored.
And so if somebody wanted to get your book, what's the best way for them to get a copy?
Of course, if you want to help Central Park, the very best way to get the copy is to go on our website, centralparknyc.org. And at the very top, very faint, but you can see the word shop, and then you can buy it from us. And the proceeds from the shop go to the Conservancy, so you can help in that way. Otherwise, you can ask your local bookstore. I know the bookstore in Southampton had it. I was very proud and happy to see my book sold there. And of course, Columbia University Press is another way to get it, and of course Amazon. But
we'll be sure to put a link in the description here to buy it right from the Conservancy's website. That way we can direct the money best as we can.
Thank you.
And we had the person who had the parks, they said they're from Montclair, New Jersey.
Montclair, New Jersey has 5 Olmsted parks. Well, you know, I'm such a New York has 5 Olmsted parks, 5 Olmsted senior parks, but the Olmsted Junior and then Olmsted, they became the largest landscape designers in the country. And in Montclair, which I once lived in, so I think Brookdale Park, Brook something Park. I ran in every day. Montclair is beautiful. And so I think they're more Olmsted Junior parks or Olmsted and Sons parks, because Olmsted, what I didn't say, if we have time, is that Olmsted's brother, it's in the book too. Olmsted's best friend was his brother, John, and John was married to Mary. His brother got tuberculosis and died in Paris. And the last letter to Fred said, please take care of Mary. And they had 3 children, one infant. He married his brother's widow, adopted his children, and his adopted son. So he was both their uncle and their father, stepfather. And he adopted, he actually was their father, he adopted them. And so John Charles Olmsted was much older than Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., but both sons became landscape architects, and the firm continued until the 1960s, when it became part of the National Historic Site in Brookline, Massachusetts. So, which if you're ever in Boston, it's a wonderful place to visit and really understand the Olmsted legacy. It's also a wonderful place to visit the Olmsted website, It just changed its name. So now I can't remember what it says, but it was NAOP.org, National Association of Olmsted Parks. But just this month, they changed their name to something with the word Olmsted in it. But if you Google, you'll find it. And they're a wonderful website if you're interested in the work. And I bet Montclair's Park would be mentioned in that.
Wow. Well, definitely a lot of great information held within this talk, and even more to be found within that book. So I definitely want to encourage everybody to check out Before Central Park. See if you can buy it from the Conservancy's website. We'll have the link below.
It's coming out as an audio book.
Oh, and it's coming out as an audiobook. So if you're not a big reader, but a great listener.
Well, the book's very heavy. But if you take walks, if you're like me and I listen to books while I'm walking around either Central Park or Hampton Bays or Southampton, I love to listen. And but you won't see the photos or the illustrations, but they will be on my website beforecentralpark.com. So you can listen and you can also see it if you prefer to the website. I don't know when it's coming up, but I will be posting it, or I will let Connor know when the audio guide is. I think you listen to it through Audible.
Okay. Yeah, no, that'd be a great way to do it if that's anybody's fancy. So, but yeah, I want to thank Sara again for coming today and doing this great talk. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.